वेलकम टू आवर नेशन स्टेट डायलॉग सीरीज राष्ट्र राज्य संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है. 欢迎收看民族国家对话系列. This is a special edition of our Women Perspectives on China, and I'm Dr. Geeta Kochar, moderator for today's discussion. Today, in our series Women Perspectives on China, we have the pleasure to host Dr. Maria Repnikova, who is an assistant professor in global communications at Georgia State University. She's also Wilson Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholar. Professor Repnikova speaks fluent Mandarin, Spanish, and Russian. In the past, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Project for Advanced Research in Global Communications at the Annenberg School of Communication, University of Pennsylvania. She received her doctorate DPhil in politics at the University of Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. She has many published works, and her latest book is Chinese Soft Power, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. And she also has a very interesting book that is on media politics in China, Improvising Power Under Authoritarianism. And that was also published by Cambridge University Press in 2017, apart from other publications. So today we have invited her to our discussion series, Women Perspectives on China, and we are going to have a larger discussion on not specifically on one book or something, but very warm welcome to you in this Nation State Dialogue series. So as your latest work is on Chinese soft power, let me begin by asking you a bit in detail about how China defines and uses soft power, and what is the role in Chinese diplomacy and nation building?
Thank you so much, Dr. Geta. It's really a pleasure to be part of this dialogue and to meet you virtually, hopefully in person one day. So in terms of the Chinese definition of soft power, the way that I look at it in this book and in other writings is by drawing on the Chinese writings themselves, how Chinese scholars and experts define and critique the idea of soft power. So what I find is that there's been a lot of interest in soft power since mid-2000s or 2007, when Hu Jintao has brought up the idea of cultural soft power and promotion of culture as part of soft power initiatives and objectives in his major speech at the 17th Party Congress. And around that time, we also see a lot of publications coming out about soft power, but it's not exactly the same kind of idea as it is or has been originally envisioned and coined by Joseph Nye in the United States. So there are two big distinctions that I see. One is concerning the motivations and target audiences of soft power, and the other concerning the resources or how soft power is to be carried out. So when it comes to motivations, in the original kind of concept of by Nye, it was all about external audiences. So it's global publics, international relations, foreign policy related kind of improvement of public opinion. When it comes to China, they see it as kind of two-faced. On one hand, there's the international side, of course, improving public opinion about China and softening China's rise, so to speak, because China has been, of course, economically dominating in many places, but also causing lots of concerns about its motivations, its influence, long-term objectives. So having some soft power, some kind of engagement with public opinion maybe can soften its image. But the other objective is also very much domestic. There's a lot of concern under Xi Jinping in particular, and we'll get into that later as well, with kind of the idea of cultural security and confidence, the notion of protecting Chinese people themselves from so-called infiltration of Western culture. And that's become very prominent as a theme under Xi, but even earlier, we see this idea of developing soft power as also creating some kind of a sense of cohesion around Chinese culture in China. And I think the way it works is because a lot of the kind of discussions about China's influence externally get reported domestically. So if China is getting some kind of positive image, or somebody's talking positively about China internationally, some of these dialogues and initiatives, they get translated to and also narrated to Chinese public that in turn can be more proud of what China is doing. So that's another side of it. And then the second big difference is that in the original concept by Joseph Nye, the idea of soft power was all about culture, values, and foreign policy, very different from coercion, cooptation. So it's not about military force, it's not about economic force. Chinese discussions often talk about critiquing this notion that hard and soft power are kind of separate, entirely separate domains, and they talk about especially material power, China's economic governance model, but also kind of political mobilization model, like the idea of that they can, beat poverty, or they can have this major mobilization campaigns, or its technological prowess, the kind of high-tech industry has been developing. All of it kind of feeds into the larger spectrum of soft power. So soft power in Chinese understanding is much more flexible and expansive concept than the way it's been originally coined and imagined by Joseph Nye.
Yeah, sounds very interesting. I mean, the whole idea that China was really talking about in the older times is Zhong Wei Pan, Chinese being the base, and Xi Wei Yung, like the Western needs to be utilized. But what you're talking about is like they wanted to get rid of the Western culture or their influence, and maybe also talking about the hard power, which was not the way Joseph Nye was really looking at. And that has really become very important, especially when Xi Jinping has come to power. But at the same time, there is one thing which China has been really using since, Mao's time to now is the media. And because you've worked a lot on the communications and media, I would just want to talk about in media in China is often seen something like as a tool of state propaganda, starting from how People's Daily was, established in Mao's time and how that was used to even present day. So do you see that Chinese media is fully controlled and directed and even utilized for state objectives even today? And if so, can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, so in Chinese media, the role of Chinese media has always evolved kind of, I think, two dimensions in the Chinese political context, even during Mao, but especially post-Mao and the reform era. One side of it is kind of guiding public opinion, so shaping public opinion, that's persuasion, propaganda, there are different terms for that. But then the other side is also kind of monitoring and reporting public grievances upwards. So it's about, trying to understand public sentiments, and that was described as the role of supervision of public opinion, monitoring role, accountability role. There are all kinds of different terms again for that, but that's quite a different role. So in the first book that I published, I talk a lot about that second role, the idea that Chinese media is not fully controlled in terms of being only serving propaganda functions, but it also has had this kind of function of state-directed sort of feedback role. So the notion of reporting on some crises, at the provincial level, at the local level, and critiquing some aspects of policy without necessarily targeting the very top or focusing on Xi Jinping in this case himself, but mostly focusing on kind of more local level kind of governance issues, and in turn helping the central party state to govern. So that's the idea that I kind of cover in that book. Under Xi Jinping, we see some of this slightly disappearing or quite a bit of shrinking when it comes to the sort of supervision role of the media. We see a lot more emphasis on hard propaganda, ideological work, and basically a lot of concern with anything that strays away from this kind of, the notion of the media role serving as a voice of the party. So we see some of this reversal, but at the same time, those voices haven't completely disappeared because Chinese media has commercialized. It's not all fully state-owned. I mean, the state still owns it, but there's certain, investment stakes from private actors, and there's also concern with readership. And of course, there are many new kind of online initiatives and citizen journalists in China as well. Despite censorship, there's all kinds of loopholes and initiatives. So for example, during the pandemic, we've seen some really impressive investigations of the origins of the pandemic and the mishandling of the virus in Wuhan by some Chinese outlets like Caixin. And we see even now with the war in Ukraine, even though it's been a very tightly controlled topic, some netizens, social media users, and some professors, they've been advocating for a more humane, more sympathetic approach towards Ukraine. So in short, there is this tightening of space officially, but unofficially, we still see some voices kind of coming out through these various loopholes, because the system of control is still porous. It's not complete, it's not absolute, because the state is still very interested in monitoring what public is thinking and feeling, and without leaving them some space to talk about issues, they'll never find out what they're actually thinking. So because they're so interested in monitoring and engaging public opinion, that leaves a little bit of room for some, sometimes subtle, sometimes more ironic critique. It's usually directed at the very core heart of the government, but there's some attempts to maybe criticize or at least make fun of and satirically engage with some policies that don't work.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the moment you're pointing about the investigative research and all of that. Citing was the first we started looking at as how, it is becoming more investigative in its journalism and things like that. Of course, things have moved a lot beyond that, in the sense, you're very right, it's commercialization. I mean, when private actors are going to invest on that, they also want some kind of, return on that. But one of the things which you are really highlighting with this, feedback sort of thing is the state-society relations. And I'll move on to the second, my next question, which is directly related to under, Xi Jinping, the power, how do you see that has come to power? I mean, Xi Jinping coming to power, and is there any change in the state-society relations in China? And how has, President Xi Jinping's control changed its relations with other regional and global powers? I mean, it's not just about the media per se, but even otherwise. I mean, of course, there is a reversal in terms of the media as a tool. But overall, so there is a lot of change on the state-society relations. What do you think about that, and how that is impacting in regional and global
Yeah, I think the state-society relations, have changed in terms of the tightening control over society, the increasing mechanisms to contain, control, supervise, and basically leave less space for feedback. So there's some feedback, but it's very institutionalized. Like there's certain channels where the public is kind of legally allowed to voice their concerns. So there's more institutionalized feedback. But when it comes to spontaneous feedback, whether it's protests or spontaneous outrage online, there's a lot more sensitivity about all kinds of expressions, and some issues and individuals who used to be relatively kind of neutral or seen as not that sensitive have become sensitive under C. For example, feminist movements, kind of women's rights issues that I think used to be somewhat sensitive, but not quite the red zone where they get imprisoned or detained. But under C, we've seen some of these activists actually detained. We'll also see some journalists who, were increasingly more likely to be detained again in this past, 6-5 years. So more control over some lawyers as well, kind of grassroots lawyers who focus on human rights issues, less tolerance basically. So I think the state-society relationship perhaps has become a little less dynamic, less kind of back and forth, because there is less room for the back and forth for society. And sometimes when we see grievances coming out, they can come out either spontaneously or kind of creatively. We see a lot of humor, satire around like the COVID situation, COVID-0 at the moment. We see some attempts to express discontent, but they're not as, I think, as frequent, or maybe they're not seen as being as listened to, right, as the way they used to be in the past. Like in the past, I think we described Chinese party state as a responsive authoritarian regime, a consultative authoritarian regime, that we used to be like the big works about Chinese politics were all about that. But I'm not sure if we need to rethink this paradigm now, because maybe things have shifted from it being responsive or consultative towards more kind of classical authoritarian regime that's maybe less interested in consultations. So it's not all absolute, of course, but I think some shift has taken place. Maybe we need to reassess some of these models or terms we use to describe what Chinese political system really is at this point under C. And perhaps some of it is also, we see some convergence with kind of Putin's Russia, where it's a lot of personalistic focus on the person himself, right? The Xi Jinping personalistic rule, ideological work around his image, not just his policies, but also his own personal history and narratives and his books and speeches. All of that gets a lot of attention. And I think that's very different from the past, where a lot of attention was placed on the party as an institution, and the leader is kind of shadowing the party, but not at the heart of this, of the political discourse. But now we see Xi is at the very heart of this discourse. And we see very similar things externally, where Xi is kind of appearing as the very face of China's foreign policy or diplomacy, and representing kind of China. So I think that's also quite a distinct shift from the previous eras.
Yeah, but one of the things, of course, you're right. There's a lot of shift. But one of the things which was quite prominently visible during President Hu Jintao's time were the mass protest, and there was a lot of reporting of that as well. So we really knew that there are kind of uneasiness, unhappiness among the masses, and there are street protests, a huge number, like 180,000, 270,000, or something like that. The figures were quite high. And they were all there in the public media to know that there is, something going on between the state-society relations, which is not so harmonious. But I mean, in this Xi Jinping era, I'm talking about the, whether we're talking about zero COVID policy that they have. Even if there is a kind of under carpet kind of, uneasiness, we really do not see that coming out. So it's a little difficult to assess whether the masses are unhappy with the way Xi Jinping is working and ideologically controlling everyone, or the people are not so very unhappy about it. They are quite happy about the kind of anti-corruption, policies he has initiated or things like that. But one of the things which you just mentioned in terms of Russia-Ukraine war is like people's voices are coming. But, there is another thing which has been a lot talked about in the media, is the kind of narratives that have been floated out, the global narrative, especially from the Ukraine side, which is very, very powerful. And that is why the world is really supporting Ukraine, not just what is happening on the ground in reality. Having said that, I think China is also talking about Taiwan as one of the cases where it wants to, either by non-violent or violent means take over Taiwan. So do you see Chinese state has pondered over it in case, there is a forceful, action on Taiwan? What would be the global narrative and how that is going to impact on China? And how is China preparing to assimilate with Taiwan vis-a-vis these narratives?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a little bit tricky I think, to fully determine how China will react or is preparing to react vis-a-vis Taiwan, because we see some mixed signaling. So on the one hand, just kind of shortly after the war, at least amongst the public expressions on social media, there have been a lot of invocation of Taiwan as kind of a similar case, or that China should be as forceful as Russia and take over Taiwan, like very nationalistic, kind of militaristic sentiments. But a lot of them have been deleted. So it seems like there's been some censorship over those very extreme positions. And then the statements made by the high-ranking kind of diplomats and officials have been kind of trying to distinguish or delink Ukraine from Taiwan. So they were saying that Ukraine and Taiwan, they're very different cases, situations. Taiwan is already kind of part of China. It's one China policy. Ukraine is not, as a sovereign state. So they were trying to really kind of distinguish between those two positions. So that's one point of difference. And then at the same time, there've been a lot of discussions about self-sufficiency, kind of China's economic self-sufficiency in particular, of how China should be preparing, maybe even not so much for narratives, but for actual actions through sanctions, just in case, it's going to be isolated in the same way that Russia is, what would happen? So that we've seen some policy documents and discussions and kind of think tank community coming out about self-sufficiency and whether or not China can achieve that, I think is debatable. The Economist just had a whole article about how it's not doing so well and or it's not possible to accomplish a self-sufficiency given that China is so entwined in the international economy, global economy. So that's another kind of point of maybe reference here. And then of course we see the war of narratives in part also coming out as a result of the recent, President Biden's visit and speech when he was asked about Taiwan, and he said the US would stand by and defend Taiwan. So in that context, Chinese diplomats and officials had to respond. So the response was quite, confident, assertive that, again, Taiwan is part of China. You have no right to make the statements. You're disrespecting our sovereignty and so forth. So we see a lot of kind of mixed signaling, and some argue that maybe China will be more hesitant towards, kind of a military reunification with Taiwan in the near future as a result of Ukraine. But others suggest that, look, Putin's regime is still standing, and it's not clear when the war is ever going to end. And there's still, countries are still buying oil and gas from Russia. So it's not like the regime is completely crushed. So maybe the lesson isn't quite as desperate or as pessimistic as it seemed at the beginning of the war. So much seems to depend on how this war is going to eventually end and what shape will Putin's regime be left in when it's over. Is this a kind of an anti-model for Xi, or is it kind of something as almost not a positive, but some kind of a case where, the regime will still survive regardless of all the pressures from the West? So a lot there, I think a lot of different variables to consider. So it's not quite clear yet, where it's going to go, which direction.
Yeah, but in terms of the narratives that I was talking about is something which is recently coming out from the US, is the threats on the sovereignty issue vis-a-vis how does it talk about the one China thing. Like the Chinese, of course, they are saying that Ukraine is different from Taiwan and the issue is different and how they're going to react is different. But Chinese have always been stressing on one China policy. And the new thing which US has been talking about, and I see a lot of that debate coming up, is US was never talking about one China policy. It was talking about one China principle. And so the policy and the principle is quite different, and how that is going to be really reshaping the sanctions that you're talking about will be based on this, because it's going to again talk about the sovereignty issue in a different perspective, But having said that, I mean, because these whole discussions that we are having is also for our scholars in India. And so, as you've been working a lot on China and China-Russia and, communication in China, the soft power in China and all of these areas. I mean, in India, we always see, China as two stories that are coming, like I'm saying, how the West perceives China. That's one story, which is a very dominant story for any scholar in India to, assess and look at China. But there's another story which is coming from China. And, only very few who know the language can actually understand what the Chinese story is all about. But as a scholar, I mean, because you know Mandarin as well, and you've been looking China from the, primary sources of understanding China from China, apart from what the Western, narrative is and how they talk about, or whatever the scholarship is created in West on China. So how should a scholar look at the two stories to have a balance and maybe a rational understanding of a very complex country like China? Any suggestions or any comments you have on that?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Of course, it all depends on whether or not one has the language skills, I guess, to be able to read Chinese sources. But even if there isn't access to Chinese sources in Chinese, I think there's a lot coming out also in English from Chinese state media in the way that they kind of try to channel their perspectives to global audiences, right? What kind of message are they trying to signal? Some of them are also varied. I mean, one has to be cautious about interpreting everything as a state policy or as a state, I guess, idea coming from the state. For example, Global Times is often cited as a party media and it's a state's representative, but it's actually quite nationalistic and commercial. So it's more of a tabloid, so that maybe have to be cautious about which sources one is using. But a lot of these, like Xinhua News Agency has English language speeches and translations. I think there's a lot of effort on the Chinese side now to kind of translate their narratives, especially official narratives, to global audiences, and one can kind of interpret from that maybe some signaling of what are they thinking, how are they thinking about those issues, and then contrast them with how the Western media is presenting similar issues. But I think alongside with that, one has to always be aware of the objectives or motivations behind either Western, discourses around China, especially as targeting maybe Indian publics, or Chinese discourses around China as targeting, again, Indian publics, because we see, of course, there's certain motivations and certain objectives that maybe are channeled through that. So if, West is criticizing China's engagements with India, obviously there's also an attempt by the West, by the US, to engage India more openly vis-a-vis China and vice versa. So I think being always kind of maybe a bit skeptical, or at least mindful of the motivations while comparing, contrasting the different sources, maybe would help to kind of create a little bit more of a coherent picture. But then also outlets like the China Media Project, for example, that I follow very closely. It's an English language website where they compile a lot of really interesting discussions about Chinese propaganda and like the latest, policies, both domestic and foreign, and they engage with lots of discussions, very complex and multifaceted discussions in English. And then SubChina is another source that I think is really great, where it's also same thing. They engage with all kinds of new propaganda slogans and policies in a very multifaceted, complex way, but through interviews and reporting. So those two, I think, are kind of my go-to when I think about, the shortcut. If you don't have time to read all the Chinese discussions, you want to go straight to something that's already kind of analyzed, distilled, and then you can go back and look at the sources if you like. So I think there's lots of different ways. It takes a little bit of time, but there's some really interesting platforms like the ones I've mentioned that might help in navigating this.
Right. I mean, yeah, most of the Indian scholars who are working on China, that's one of the ways they really find it easy to understand China, because not everyone is so competent in the language, and not everyone can use all the language sources. And it's really time consuming also to really go through that.
Definitely.
But you just mentioned about India in terms of the relations, but I don't know whether you really know about India-China relations so deep or not, because that's not your focus of research. But I mean, because we are doing it for Indians as well, and in India, one of the issues that really I want to push you to answer is India is facing really adversarial relations with China due to our border tensions, and which is a very critical issue. India is not so much of focus across the globe right now in terms of what is happening on the border, but of course the border issues itself is a trigger of where the tension lies. So there's a lot of sort of information war on social media that is progressing. So how do you think that India as a country that has not really used the tools of soft power and of narratives control deal with this emerging global realities? Because now, I mean, soft power or even the creation of narratives is one of the hot subjects when we talk about real concrete wars. Whether you win the war on ground or not is a secondary issue right now. So besides, how do you see, the Chinese use the digital Silk Road, which is one of the very interesting, under the Belt and Road Initiative is one of the interesting things which is developing. How do you see these new realities which are coming? And this is my last question to you. And of course, we can continue on that, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a difficult question in terms of the India-China relations. I'm not, of course, an expert in this area. Sometimes the questions come through as part of just analyzing China's engagements in Asia, but also India is such an important country in looking at the current geopolitical realities, whether it's the war in Ukraine or, US kind of China-India triangle, or even Russia-India-China relations. I think it's really interesting to look at it, and I look forward to maybe thinking and studying and hopefully visiting India one day in the future. But in terms of China's kind of war of narratives or how it's engaging with this, digital Silk Road, I think the digital Silk Road is a bit, to me, it's kind of much bigger project. It's also mostly about technology building, so kind of providing technological resources, whether it's high-speed Wi-Fi, 5G, Huawei phones, any kind of telecom construction, smart city technology. To me, a lot of it is about infrastructure, but also because it involves Chinese companies and brands, it often carries certain ideas with it, right? There are certain limitations and opportunities, and even training academies and so forth. So digital Silk Road is kind of a massive, I think, kind of high-tech infrastructure project that they're building across BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, and trying to expand all over the world with whoever agrees to work with them, basically on bilateral basis or on kind of transnational basis. But when it comes to narratives, I think it's a very mixed picture. On the one hand, we see the attempt to kind of create some kind of a narrative that's more constructive about China, China's image, China's role, often through state media. We see somewhat softer, more balanced approaches. But when it comes to online kind of narrative, battles and Chinese diplomats, we see an increasing assertiveness through wolf warrior diplomats and, this so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, meaning that it pushes back, it asserts China's interests. And I think that's where the problem often lies, is that sometimes those diplomats will trigger or kind of try to warrant a certain response. And then those responses and messages are translated to Chinese public, who ends up engaging in a very nationalistic kind of discussion about whether it's India and the border issues or the US and COVID or something else. So they get really triggered by this messaging, and it's very difficult to find balance and find some kind of more constructive space for discussion. But I think one thing to also note is that some of these narratives, they're basically, the whole aim is to get some attention from the other side. Oh, sorry about that. So if there is no attention given to these narratives from, say, Indian intellectuals or policymakers, these narratives kind of disappear. They don't have a lot of influence unless they're engaged with. So oftentimes, because there's an engagement from the other side, it inflames even more response and back and forth, and it turns into the so-called war of narratives. But sometimes when those narratives are ignored, there's really not much that happens because they just don't have any audience. So I think they're looking for a controversial take or an audience or somebody to take it up and kind of, fight back. But if there isn't really a pickup of that narrative, sometimes it disappears or dissolves by itself, or it only stays within the domestic Chinese audience. So it's just something I've been thinking about as, also looking at kind of the current situation in Ukraine. A lot of this interpretation in the US is that China is supporting, Russia, or we have to respond. But a lot of these narratives are really aimed at domestic audiences. I think it's the same thing with the India conflict and tensions. They're aimed at domestic nationalistic publics, less so than maybe at Indian public itself. So that's something I think it's worth keeping in mind when one sees those messages. They can be kind of offensive or inflammatory, but I think these messages are translated specifically for domestic nationalism as a sentiment that is very important for maintaining the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think has been a trend since, Mao was in the power, where People's Daily was made as a tool for using it for its propaganda. It was all for the domestic nationalism to be to really legitimize the rule that it was there. And 5G war, anyway, we have been seeing the Huawei thing, which is really a tussle between US and China. We have all seen that trade war emerge out of that, and probably the new future war is going to be the cyber space that is going to be more tricky. Having said that, it was a great pleasure talking and listening to you, Professor Maria Repnico. Hope we continue our interactions, and thank you to our viewers. Please keep watching and listening to our programs. Thank you very much. Namaskar.